So today I want to take you through something that almost nobody is interpreting correctly. And I want you to really slow down while listening to this. Because if you misunderstand the frame, you will misunderstand the entire direction of global politics in the next decade. On April 7th, 2026, something happened at the United Nations Security Council that looked on the surface like a routine diplomatic disagreement. Another resolution, another veto, another round of predictable accusations between major powers. Western media immediately reduced it to a simple moral storyline: China and Russia versus the international community. China and Russia protecting Iran, China and Russia obstructing peace and stability in the Strait of Hormuz. But if that is your interpretation, you are still looking at the surface layer. And in geopolitics, the surface layer is almost always designed to mislead you. Because here is the first question that should immediately break that narrative apart. Why would China, the largest importer of crude oil in the world, a country whose economy depends heavily on energy flows from the Gulf, block a resolution that supposedly ensures freedom of navigation through one of the most important energy choke points on the planet? If your understanding is correct, China should be desperate to reopen the strait. China should be leading the charge. China should be supporting any international mechanism that guarantees uninterrupted oil flow. And yet, China vetoed it. So either China acted irrationally, which is unlikely given its long-term strategic consistency, or the resolution itself meant something very different from how it was publicly presented. Now, let's reconstruct what actually happened inside that Security Council process, because this detail matters more than anything else. The original draft proposed by Bahrain was extremely aggressive in legal terms. It authorized member states to use all necessary means to ensure freedom of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. And in diplomatic language, all necessary means is not symbolic. It is a direct legal gateway to military intervention. That means naval enforcement, blockade breaking, potential strikes on coastal military infrastructure, escalation under international authorization. In other words, it was not just about reopening the strait, it was about who gets the legal right to force it open. And that distinction is everything. Now, initially, there was pushback even from within the Western Bloc. Russia, China, and even France raised concerns that this wording essentially opened the door to a new military escalation in the Gulf. So the draft was revised. The military language was softened. All necessary means was reduced. Offensive clarity was diluted. The resolution was reframed as a more neutral enforcement mechanism, but even then, China and Russia still vetoed it. So it was revised again. This time, even the implicit authorization of force was removed. The text became more procedural, more diplomatic, more focused on maritime law and international coordination. At that point, Western diplomats believed the objections would disappear. They did not. China and Russia vetoed again. And this is the point where most analysts stop thinking and start repeating headlines. But if you continue the analysis logically, something becomes very clear. This was not a disagreement about wording. This was a disagreement about strategic consequences. Because every version of the resolution, no matter how softened, carried the same underlying shift in power. It would have positioned the United States and its allies as the primary enforcers of maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz under the legitimacy of the United Nations. And that is the key, because once you understand that, you understand why this was never just about Iran. It was about control. Control of the most important energy choke point in the world, control of the legal framework around military intervention, and ultimately control of global trade vulnerability. Now, the Western argument was simple. Iran is destabilizing the strait. Iran is threatening global energy security. Therefore, the international community must intervene. But China's perspective is structurally different. China does not evaluate these situations as isolated crises. It evaluates them as long-term precedent-setting mechanisms. And precedents are more powerful than wars because once a precedent is established that the United States can act, enforce, and militarily intervene in a global choke point under UN authorization, that precedent does not disappear when the crisis ends. It becomes part of the architecture of global power. And now we reach the core strategic question. What does China lose if the United States gains legal and operational dominance over the Strait of Hormuz under UN cover? The answer is not just oil disruption. That is the short-term layer. The deeper answer is leverage, because China imports millions of barrels of oil per day through maritime routes that are ultimately vulnerable to Western naval dominance. If the United States can, under international legitimacy, enforce control over Hormuz, then it is not just securing oil flow. It is reinforcing the structural reality that global energy security ultimately depends on American-controlled sea power. And that is exactly what China has been trying to systematically weaken for 2 decades. This is where we need to introduce something crucial, the concept of strategic dependency. In Chinese strategic thinking, dependency is not just economic. It is geopolitical vulnerability encoded into trade routes. The Strait of Hormuz is one such dependency node. So is Malacca. So are several maritime choke points that collectively form what Chinese analysts often describe as the maritime vulnerability chain. Now, imagine if the United States, under UN legitimacy, demonstrated that it can militarily enforce one of those choke points. That is not just a tactical operation. That is a message. And the message is the global energy system still ultimately rests under American maritime authority. Now, if you are China, that is not acceptable in the long term. So the veto begins to make sense, not as a reaction to Iran, but as a refusal to institutionalize American strategic dominance in legal form. But there's a second layer here that is even more important. And this is where most analysts completely miss the shift. Because China is not just defending against a loss. It is positioning itself within a transition away from a unipolar world. Let's bring in the second system level structure, the petrodollar system. Since the 1970s, global oil trade has been denominated in US dollars. This created an artificial but powerful global demand for dollars, reinforcing American financial dominance even beyond its industrial base. Every barrel of oil traded reinforces dollar liquidity. Every energy transaction reinforces US financial centrality. Every crisis in oil markets tends to flow back into dollar strength. But systems like this are not static. They are sensitive to shocks. Now consider what happens when the Strait of Hormuz becomes militarized, contested, or intermittently disrupted. Global energy flows become unstable. Pricing volatility increases. Gulf exporters begin seeking alternative settlement mechanisms. Buyers begin experimenting with non-dollar contracts to hedge against disruption. And this is where China's long-term strategy becomes visible, because China is not trying to preserve the existing system. China is trying to build parallel systems, yuan-denominated energy trade, bilateral currency swaps, alternative settlement infrastructures through belt and road-linked financial networks. So from China's perspective, prolonged stress on the current system is not purely negative. It is transitional pressure, not collapse, but erosion. And erosion is what creates space for alternatives. Now, of course, this does not mean China wants oil disruption in the simplistic sense. That would be an incorrect interpretation. What it means is that China prioritizes structural advantage over short-term stability. And this distinction is critical because while Western policy tends to prioritize immediate system stability, Chinese strategy often prioritizes directional movement of the system itself. Now, let's go even deeper. If the resolution had passed and if the United States had gained legitimacy to enforce maritime security in Hormuz, then the crisis would likely have moved toward rapid de-escalation under Western-controlled terms. That would have stabilized oil flows quickly, reduced volatility, and restored predictability. But it would also have restored Western credibility as the ultimate guarantor of global energy security. And that is precisely what China is trying to prevent from being reaffirmed in a new geopolitical era. Because once credibility is reaffirmed, it becomes harder to challenge. So what China did through the veto was not simply block a resolution. It prevented a re-legitimation of American structural authority in a critical region. Now, there is another dimension here that is often ignored entirely, and that is the global South perception layer. Because while Western media framed this as China protecting Iran, much of Asia, Africa, and Latin America interpreted differently. They did not see it as ideological alignment. They saw it as precedent resistance because many of these states have their own historical memory of interventions justified under international frameworks that later expanded beyond their original scope. So from that perspective, China's veto is not simply geopolitical maneuvering. It is signaling a signal that the Security Council is not automatically aligned with Western enforcement preferences. And that signal has long-term diplomatic consequences far beyond this single crisis. Now, let's bring everything together. Militarily, China did not escalate. Economically, China accepted short-term friction, but preserved long-term optionality. Politically, China reinforced its identity as a counterweight to unilateral enforcement. And narratively, China positioned itself as a blocker of precedent expansion rather than an aggressor in a regional conflict. And this is why, from a strategic analysis perspective, the veto cannot be reduced to pro-Iran or anti-West. It is more accurately described as system architecture resistance. Resistance to the expansion of one actor's legal military reach over critical global infrastructure. Now, the final question is this: was it worth it? And that depends entirely on time horizons. Because if you look at the next 3 months, oil disruption hurts everyone, markets react, supply chains tighten, political pressure rises globally. But if you look at the next 5 to 10 years, the effects of precedent, institutional authority, and system drift matter far more than short-term volatility. And this is where China's calculation becomes clear. Because in long horizon games, the player who shapes the rules of enforcement often matters more than the player who temporarily stabilizes the crisis. So when people ask who won the vote at the United Nations, they are asking the wrong question. The real question is not who supported which side. The real question is what kind of world becomes more likely because of this decision. And once you frame it that way, the answer becomes far more complex than any headline can capture. Because what happened on April 7th was not just a veto, it was a boundary being drawn around how far enforcement authority can expand in a contested multipolar system. And that is where the real story begins, not ends. Now, let's continue from where we left off, because to really understand the significance of what happened at the United Nations on April 7th, you cannot stop at the level of immediate outcomes. You have to zoom out even further beyond the resolution itself, beyond the veto, beyond the Strait of Hormuz, and ask a more uncomfortable question. What happens when no single power can reliably convert its military preference into global legal authority anymore? Because that is what this moment is really revealing. Not a regional dispute, not a temporary energy crisis, but a structural shift in how global authority itself is validated. For most of the post-Cold War era, there was an assumption embedded into international politics that when the United States pushed for a major strategic action, especially under the framework of collective security, it would eventually succeed in shaping the legal narrative around that action. Sometimes through consensus, sometimes through coalition pressure, sometimes through abstentions that quietly allowed the outcome to pass. But the underlying pattern was consistent. The system bent, even if it resisted. What changed on April 7th is not simply that China and Russia said no, it is that the system did not bend at all, even when the language was softened, even when military authorization was removed, even when diplomatic framing was adjusted multiple times to reduce friction. The outcome remained unchanged. And that creates a new kind of signal in international relations, a signal that many analysts are still not fully comfortable interpreting, because it suggests that we are no longer operating in a system where legitimacy flows automatically from institutional momentum. We are now operating in a system where legitimacy is actively contested at the highest level, in real time, inside the core institutions themselves. Now, to understand why this matters, we need to go one layer deeper into the logic of veto power itself. A veto is not just a defensive tool. It is a structural break on universal consensus. And in a unipolar world, that break is rarely used in a coordinated way against the dominant power. But in a multipolar world, it becomes a coordination mechanism among rising powers to prevent institutional drift toward a single strategic direction. That is exactly what we observed. Not alignment on ideology, but alignment on constraint. And constraint in geopolitics is often more important than agreement, because agreement builds cooperation, but constraint defines boundaries. Now, let's revisit the central paradox that still confuses many observers. If China is heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil, why would it tolerate any scenario that risks instability in that flow, even indirectly? The answer lies in something that traditional analysis often underestimates: controlled instability versus monopolized stability. From a purely surface level economic perspective, stability is always preferable. But from a strategic systems perspective, monopolized stability can be more dangerous than managed instability. Why? Because monopolized stability often comes with embedded leverage. If one actor or coalition becomes the primary guarantor of stability, then stability itself becomes conditional. Conditional on compliance, conditional on alignment, conditional on strategic behavior. In this case, if the United States becomes the unquestioned enforcer of maritime stability in the Strait of Hormuz under international legitimacy, then stability is no longer neutral. It becomes structured through American enforcement capacity. And that enforcement capacity can, in future scenarios, be redirected, repackaged, or repurposed. Not necessarily in this crisis, but in future crises. And in long horizon strategic thinking, that possibility is enough to justify resistance. So what China is optimizing for is not instability, it is distributed authority over stability enforcement. A world where no single actor can claim uncontested legitimacy over critical choke points. Now let's talk about something even more subtle. the psychological dimension of precedent, because international politics is not only about material outcomes, it is also about what actors believe is possible. If the resolution had passed, it would have reinforced a very specific belief across global institutions that in moments of energy crisis, the United States can successfully mobilize collective legal authorization for force projection in key maritime regions. That belief alone has consequences, even if the force is never fully used, because belief structures shape future responses before decisions are even made. Now, by blocking the resolution, China and Russia introduce ambiguity back into that belief system. They signal that such authorization is not automatic, that it can be stopped. And once something can be stopped once, it is no longer perceived as guaranteed in future scenarios. That changes negotiation behavior across the system. It changes risk calculations in regional capitals. It changes how smaller states interpret alignment pressure. And most importantly, it changes how crises escalate in the first place. Because escalation is not only about action, it is about expectation. Now, let's move into the economic layer again, but in a more dynamic way. Most commentary focused on oil flows and short-term price shocks. But the deeper economic shift is about transaction architecture. When energy markets become unstable, the question is not just who supplies oil. It is also in what currency, through what settlement system, and under whose financial oversight that oil is traded. The petrodollar system is not just a pricing mechanism. It is a liquidity recycling mechanism. Oil exporters accumulate dollars. Those dollars are reinvested into Western financial markets, sovereign debt instruments, and strategic sectors. This creates a feedback loop between energy consumption and financial dominance. Now, when that loop is disrupted, even partially, the effects are not immediate collapse. They are gradual rerouting of capital flows. And capital flows, once rerouted, rarely return to their original pathways without significant geopolitical reversal. So, from China's perspective, any prolonged disruption to the existing energy trade environment is not simply a cost. It is a redistribution event in global financial architecture. And redistribution events create opportunity windows. This is why the veto cannot be understood in isolation. It is part of a broader pattern of resistance to centralized financial and military control over global choke points. Now, let's address the counter-argument directly, because this is where most simplistic interpretations attempt to regain control of the narrative. The argument goes like this: China is overinterpreting the situation. The Strait of Hormuz crisis is a direct threat to its economy. Therefore, blocking a resolution that could stabilize the situation is irrational or overly ideological. But this argument assumes that the only relevant variable is short-term economic efficiency. That assumption fails to account for strategic vulnerability accumulation, because in geopolitics, the most dangerous condition is not short-term loss. It is long-term dependency embedded inside stable systems. A stable system that concentrates control over critical infrastructure is more strategically dangerous than a temporarily unstable system where control is contested. That is the core divergence in worldview. One side optimizes for immediate system repair. The other optimizes for long-term system structure. Now, let's zoom out to the level of global order. What we are witnessing is not the collapse of institutions. It is the fragmentation of consensus inside institutions. The United Nations Security Council is still functioning. Resolutions are still being proposed. Votes are still being cast. Diplomatic language is still being negotiated. But the assumption that this institution can reliably produce unified global enforcement legitimacy is weakening. And once that assumption weakens, the role of the institution changes fundamentally. It shifts from an enforcement enabler to a negotiation arena. That distinction is critical because enforcement enablers produce action. Negotiation arenas produce delay, contestation, and strategic signaling. And in a multipolar world, delay is not neutral. Delay is power because it forces actors to operate without guaranteed institutional backing. Now, let's connect this back to the Strait of Hormuz specifically. The strait is not just a geographical choke point. It is a psychological choke point in global energy security. It represents the fragility of global trade concentration, a single narrow passage through which a massive proportion of global oil supply flows. And because of that, it becomes a recurring focal point for power projection debates. Who can secure it? Who can disrupt it? Who can legally intervene in it? And most importantly, who gets to define what security in that region actually means? The April 7th veto was not just about one resolution. It was about refusing to allow one definition of security to become globally institutionalized. Now, as we move toward the final layer of analysis, we need to confront something uncomfortable. Because in most geopolitical narratives, there is a temptation to assign victory and defeat too quickly, to say one side won and another side lost. But in reality, major systemic transitions do not produce clean winners. They produce shifting advantage gradients. And those gradients only become visible over time. So instead of asking who won the vote, the more accurate question is this. Which direction did the system move? And the answer, if we are being structurally honest, is that the system moved further away from centralized enforcement legitimacy and closer toward distributed veto competition. That is not collapse. That is reconfiguration. And reconfiguration periods are historically the most unstable, but also the most creatively open phases of global order. Because during reconfiguration, rules are not fixed. They are being rewritten in real time through repeated acts of resistance, negotiation, and constraint. Now, let's bring this to a close by returning to the original paradox. Why would China veto a resolution that on paper protects an energy route it depends on? Because in China's strategic logic, the question is not whether the route is protected. The question is who gets to define protection, under what legal authority, and with what future implications. And if protection comes with embedded structural dominance by a rival power, then protection itself becomes a form of dependency. So the veto is not a rejection of stability. It is a rejection of asymmetrical control embedded inside stability. And that is the distinction. Most analysis misses entirely. So when you step back from the headlines, from the emotional framing, from the simplified narratives of allies and adversaries, what remains is something far more important. A global system in transition, not yet restructured, not yet stabilized, but actively being contested at its most fundamental institutional level. And in that context, actions like vetoes are not just procedural events. They are structural signals that define the limits of what is still possible within the existing order. And once those limits are tested enough times, the order itself begins to evolve slowly, unevenly, but irreversibly. So the real significance of April 7th is not that a resolution failed. It is that the boundaries of consensus were visibly redrawn in front of the entire world. And once boundaries are redrawn at that level, they rarely return to where they were before. That is the real story. not the vote itself. But the world that the vote is quietly